Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation. The COVID-19 pandemic put the interrelationship between freedom of religion or belief and the right to health, specifically in the public health context, into sharp focus. So today I have the pleasure of discussing one of the most complex and interesting human rights with you, and what has happened to it during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this is rather ambitious, as I only have 30 minutes. I hope that I will be able to give you, I think, an overview, perhaps, rather than an in-depth analysis of some of the challenges and best practices. So I'd like to go through with you what is freedom of religion or belief. I think it's very important to give an overview of what the right is if we're to understand how it's been affected by the pandemic. And I'd like to look at what exactly states have committed themselves to in terms of freedom of religion or belief. And then we will look at some of the permissible limitations to freedom of religion or belief. You will see one of them, of course, being public health. And then we will look at the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on freedom of religion or belief. And I would just say to that, of course, we'll be looking at effects on the state and also on religious or belief communities and individuals. So one challenge with the term FORB is that it's a shorthand. So we have many different names for this right, which I think already makes it somehow confusing. Is it religious freedom? Is it freedom of thought, conscience, and religion? Is it freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief? Or is it freedom of religion or belief? Of course, it's all of them. It's a matter of some of them outlining all of the parts that are in the right, and others being more of this sort of shorthand, as I said. And I think it's important to remember when we're talking about the right, if we name it something like religious freedom, that it also includes this freedom of thought and of conscience, and that it's not just about religion, it's also about belief, that it's not a right that protects religions per se, but it's a right that protects human beings. And this is fundamental when we think of human rights. If we think about human rights, what do they actually do? Why do we have them? And human rights are there to meet basic human needs. They're not there to protect vaguely defined religious values or religious sentiment. So this is not a superfluous right. This is a right that really protects people. And I think in countries where religion has been replaced by secularist approaches in the public sphere, the idea perhaps that a right that includes religion or belief may seem somewhat strange to understand. But of course, this right is not just for religious individuals, it also protects those who are secularist. They can be religious and secularist, I should note, but secularist, non-secularist, humanist, atheist, and it really cuts to the core of individual identity. It's a right allowing people, or giving the possibility of each individual to search for and determine meaning in our own lives. So the right is more, as I said, about freedom than it is about religion. And when we look at it then at a macro level or a societal level, for example, we can start to understand that this right facilitates our living together peacefully with our diversity, as opposed to being about some sort of imposed state of harmony where we can't say what we really think or can't share our inner convictions for fear of being subject to discrimination or maybe hate crimes or arrest or worse. So I'd like to introduce you to two international standards. There are more, but I think that these are the reference ones. They're both UN texts. The first is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The second, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in both, it's Article 18 that speaks of freedom of religion or belief. So we'll look at what actually states have committed themselves to. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or UDHR, Article 18, everybody, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Now, I'm aware it says his, of course. This language is perhaps not as gender sensitive as we're used to, but we're talking about his or her, everybody, everyone, as it says in the beginning. And if we look then at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we note that the first paragraph of that also starts with this: everyone shall have the right to. I won't go into the differences between this paragraph and that we've just read. There are a couple, but essentially it's a similar idea. Then we look at paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, and here we have extra text. Paragraph 2, no one shall be subject to coercion. This is very important. We should be free to choose. It shouldn't be something that we shouldn't be forced to take on particular religion or belief. Paragraph 3, we talk about the limitations here. It can be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law, necessary to protect public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedom of others. And then paragraph 4 speaks about the respect for liberty of parents, education of children. We won't dwell on that, but we will move on. I would note just in the limitations perhaps that one element that's missing when we see a list, of course, we always have to think, what are the absences? What has not been stated? And one of those is national security or public emergency. That is not there, and that's not a ground to limit the right. So the right is normally split into two parts. We have this forum internum, which is the sort of internal part of the right. By that I mean it's about your ability to have a religion or belief, to leave, to change, or to adopt any religion or belief of your choice. Now, if we think about this, and I think it's important just to dwell on this for a moment, because when we come on to talk about the pandemic, a lot of what we've seen has been the exacerbation of existing tensions. So change and difference can be very uncomfortable. It implies some sort of critique. If you leave something, there is usually a reason why you've left it. And personal change can upset religious sensitivities, also within families, within communities, and for states. States might not necessarily, not all states, like it when people convert to particular religions or beliefs that they don't necessarily welcome on their territory. Especially when a religion or belief is conflated, a majority religion or belief is conflated with national identity, or with a political party, perhaps, or a particular ideology. And people, of course, can be seen then as betraying something or causing division. And sometimes then in national legislation, we see words like, religious harmony or tolerance or coexistence. And this idea of changing is seen to upset that. The idea of proselytism, sharing your faith, can be seen to upset that. And of course, which religion or belief? Freedom of religion or belief covers people of all religions and beliefs. It's not just about those who adhere to traditional religions that are favoured perhaps by the state religions, or religions and beliefs with institutional characteristics or practices and beliefs that are similar to those of the traditional religions. It covers smaller groups. It covers theistic, as I mentioned, non-theistic, atheistic beliefs too. It covers all fundamental beliefs. So this can also be taken to include, for example, environmentalism or veganism, socialism, and I could go on. All of these have been found to fall within the scope of this right. And I won't dwell on this too much, but just to say that according to the European Court of Human Rights, for example, a belief has to meet certain standards nonetheless of seriousness, coherence, and importance to the person and their life, giving them meaning in their life. So beliefs have to go beyond mere opinion, is what I want to say by that. And I would just maybe add that, importantly, freedom of religion or belief sees all religions and beliefs as equal. There is no hierarchy of religions or faiths. They can't be ranked. It doesn't protect people from being offended on behalf of a religion or belief. People should be able to disagree. Professor Heiner Bielefeld, who was a former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, used to talk about freedom of religion or belief as a non-harmonious peace project. So it's not about harmony. It's not about protecting a dominant religious culture from change or from conversion of members. And these can be highly controversial, as I said, especially where religious and cultural identities are conflated. But it's about protecting the ability to disagree within society, and to disagree, we're not talking about sort of incitement to violence, we're talking about disagreeing well. Now, whilst I noted that freedom of religion or belief is an individual right, it also has a collective component, because it's individuals, as we noted in the text, individuals with others. And this is because, of course, when people come together, perhaps to practice a faith, they do so often in community with others. And this is the forum externum. It's this manifestation of a religion or belief. And UN General Comment 22 notes that belief is to be widely construed, but practice can also, of course, be very widely construed. There are many, many different elements that can fall into practice and into worship. Worship can extend to ritual and ceremonial acts that give expression to belief. So, for example, it includes, and this is a non-exhaustive list, sharing your faith with others, proselytizing in a non-coercive way, or running missionary activities. It's freedom to assemble in connection, with a religion or belief, and to establish and maintain places of worship. It's about being able to have your own buildings, to be able to use religious symbols and items, perhaps in rituals. It's about religious dress, being able to dress according to your religion or belief. It's about being able to write, issue, or disseminate relevant publications in these areas. It's a right that allows you to teach your religion or belief in places that are suitable for these purposes. And of course, there are differences here as well when we think of the area of education. Is it education in a religious instruction, or is it of a religion? And this is a very interesting area, but I won't go into, but I just mentioned that to you. It's about being able to solicit and receive voluntary, financial, and other contributions to be able to operate. It's about being able to run charitable or humanitarian institutions, training or appointing your own leaders. I'm sorry, it seems it's frozen again. Sorry, I'll go back. There we are. It's about practicing rites, observing days of rest or celebrations. It's about communicating internationally and registering with the state if you wish to do so. And some may not wish to do so. And why do I flag all of these elements? Because, of course, many of them, if not all of them, have been affected in some way by the pandemic. And this is what we will come to look at in a minute. But first, on state obligations, then the state should respect. It should leave individuals and communities to do as they see fit in the area of freedom of religion or belief. There is a non-intervention obligation of the state as the norm. Intervention is an exception. So we could think of, for example, the circulation of religious materials. The state does not need to be involved in that. The state also has an obligation to protect. States are obliged to take measures to protect against third parties interfering in the freedom of religion or belief of others. If we think of how violations to the right occur, they can occur by state or non-state actors. Sometimes we see in certain countries social hostilities targeting members of religious or belief communities. And here the state has an obligation to protect citizens from such hostilities. So it should combat, for example, hate crimes, but it should also prevent discrimination within its own legislation. And it should facilitate. So it should put in place positive measures in order to ensure that freedom of religion and belief is exercised easily and remove barriers. For example, we can think of access to places of worship, which of course has been a big topic during the pandemic. We could think of recognition of legal status so that some communities are able to operate And in some countries, they must have legal status to be able to operate, which, yes, it is problematic. It's about accommodating, where possible, the needs of particular individuals and promoting tolerance. Now, we saw in the ICCPR, we saw that restrictions and manifestations are only possible under strict conditions. And I should mention that restrictions to the forum internum are not permissible under any circumstances. And these are, if it's prescribed by law, proportionate to a legitimate aim, non-discriminatory, it should be non-discriminatory, can be to protect public health, protect public safety, protect public morals, protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. And I've missed order also there, but I would just flag it. So at the outset of the pandemic, within a matter of weeks, of course, the majority of states across the OSCE area, which is what I work on, but globally, put in place some sort of emergency regimes. Many ordered lockdowns, shuttered down transport links, closed borders, imposed states of emergency. And these were unprecedented times. And I think it's important to consider that states, they'd never seen this pandemic before, they've never seen COVID before, and they didn't quite know what the effects of this would be. Now, as we just saw, of course, freedom of religion or belief is a fundamental human right with two parts, the internal and the external. The internal that cannot be restricted, the external with all of the various manifestations that can be restricted on the grounds of public health or safety. But as noted, restrictions shouldn't be arbitrary or imposed indefinitely. They should have a legitimate aim and be proportionate to the challenges that they seek to solve. Now, on the challenges, there's some research on this. Inevitably, there will be much more in years to come. But I'd like to just base my comments on this document that you see. It's a ODIHR report, Human Dimension Commitments and State Responses to the COVID-19 Pandemic. And in it, there is a section on freedom of religion or belief. Now, of course, in commenting upon the challenges, context matters. In different contexts, there are different challenges for different actors, be they state actors, national or local, or be they religious or belief communities and actors within those communities, who are all different, of course. No one religion is practiced in exactly the same way. I mean, there are many different practices within different religious traditions as well. And of course, they're not all starting from a level playing field, as mentioned. Some will be seen by the state as preferred, perhaps a state religion, perhaps a religion that's consulted by the state. Others may never have been consulted by the state, or in fact could be deemed by said state to be extremists or unfavorable, undesirable actors operating within state territory. On states then, in response to the virus, depending on the spread of COVID-19 within the state as well, of course, certain states chose to impose very high levels of restrictions, effectively banning prayer meetings, banning public displays of worship, as well as public religious gatherings. Others imposed highly restrictive measures, banning perhaps religious gatherings, but allowing for private prayer to be accommodated in certain public places of worship. Others maybe took more moderate approaches, allowing public gatherings to take place, but with limits on attendance. And some others had opted for lower level restrictions, allowing public religious celebrations subject to physical distancing or without any limitations. And of course, many states varied between these options throughout the pandemic, and as the lockdowns came into place and then went out, and then new ones were imposed, etc. In the best cases, states consulted with a wide range of actors, but this did not always happen, or did not always happen throughout, or not everyone was consulted, as the state only had connections to certain actors. I'd like you all to just imagine that you are a civil servant in charge of regulating what should happen with regards to freedom of religion or belief. And what would you do? Would you reach out to the state religion first? Would you reach out to those that you know are representative bodies of major religions, or would you conduct some sort of major stakeholder mapping? Maybe you have already conducted that. I mean, there are many different starting points that states were coming at this from, and those without perhaps a level of religious literacy will also have approached it in a very different way to those who come from particular religious traditions with their own biases. So in terms of compliance, I should say some religious or belief communities elected to impose stricter restrictions than those required by law. Most complied with public health directives from governments, and some adopted voluntary restrictions on their activities following public health recommendations, but some also refused. We don't always hear that, I think, in presentations on freedom of religion or belief and COVID. We often hear the very positive stories, and I will talk about some more positive aspects, but some also refused. Some were religious leaders were arrested because they defied national and regional orders. And so such arrests, of course, caused tensions, were mediatized, and of course some unrest too. And when we look then at practice within communities, as you remember, the non-exhaustive list I showed you, manifestations are wide. And of course, many communities meet in large groups and they were unable to do so. So the impact upon communities has been profound. Beyond these places being able to meet in places of worship or home gatherings, restrictions to counter measures made it more difficult for communities to perhaps mark important stages of life, such as weddings or births or deaths and all of the ceremonies around that. For some communities, practice is more important than belief, perhaps, that it's that regular meeting together and practice that really matters to a person, and they were maybe unable to do that. And of course, this has a psychological effect on people too. It also meant that in terms of practice, religious communities were not always able to organize themselves in the same way in their charitable activities, and had to find different ways to adapt. Of course, some individuals and communities in certain countries have been more affected than others, and from those from disadvantaged backgrounds have perhaps been targeted in the past on the grounds of their religion or belief pre-COVID, have been particularly affected during the pandemic period. There have also been controversies over dates chosen for lockdowns when they fell in different parts of different religious calendars, whether on purpose or not. Even manifestations you might not expect to have been affected were, for example, the wearing of religious dress. In some countries, religious groups have been scapegoated and blamed as super spreaders of the virus. And such accusations are, of course, new ways of framing old hateful narratives. And these have been manifested in hateful speech, online, offline, also in hate crimes, which has left many to not wish to display their religious adherence, perhaps opting not to wear particular items of religious dress. We see this actually in our hate crime reporting. And of course, there are online ramifications too, as more people move online, also to worship, more services, etc. have happened online. This has provided a vital lifeline on the one hand to certain communities and enabled people to attend meetings, some even for the first time. But in other places, there's been growing concern that state authorities might utilize this trend for surveillance, monitoring, or the collection of digital footprints for profiling purposes. And of course, let's not forget that that violations of the right are perpetrated by sometimes state, sometimes non-state actors. We all know that that targeting of religious minorities online was a big problem pre-COVID, but of course that's been exacerbated by the move of more people into this space, some of whom have a sense of security, perhaps writing things online that they wouldn't have said necessarily in public, and this has been at times a false sense of security. And I will end with the slide on good practices. So at the start of the pandemic, of course, we saw many blanket bans on public worship. Many states soon, though, considered that these were excessive and looked to find ways to facilitate freedom of religion or belief whilst preserving public health. So careful legal assessment of such measures is, of course, a good practice, as is the increased cooperation between state authorities and religious or belief communities. If you want to know how a particular measure is going to affect a community, it's good to talk with them in advance of implementing the measure if possible. And of course, I know that things moved very fast during the pandemic, but of course, consultation, regular consultation is also important. And one example of cooperation between authorities and civil society related to the easing of lockdown restrictions is that religious leaders and UK government together established a task force to develop a plan to enable the phased, safe and evidence-based reopening of places of worship after they had been shut. Of course, consultation reduces the chances of indirect discrimination, and it reduces blind spots. Different religious or belief communities have different resources and different practices. It also ensures, though, that religious communities are aware of why restrictions are put in place. If you don't understand why, perhaps you'll be less likely to want to abide by such measures, and it gives them a voice in that and a potential buy-in. It also, I think it also helps to dismantle prejudice when you bring together different actors from across different religious divides to discuss the issues of common concern together, and to encourage them to work together also. So guidance on implementation is also very important. When states, of course, put in measures into place, it's important to illustrate how these can be implemented. Sometimes some of the measures were quite unclear, leaving communities unsure of what exactly they should be doing. And so guidance, of course, is another good practice. I won't dwell on this because I would like to maybe end by showing that video if possible. But I will just say that, of course, religious or belief communities and organisations have played different roles in responding, but many have also worked to offer assistance to those who are most vulnerable within society, supporting health services, for example, reaching out with psychological or spiritual guidance against a sort of backdrop of stress and anxiety and tensions. Some have also spoken out against rising nationalism and xenophobia. And this sort of scapegoating of particular communities as super spreaders. And of course, it's always powerful when someone from a different religious or belief community speaks out against such narratives, and that those narratives are not just left for the specific communities to deal with and tackle themselves. So lastly, I will just mention a point on vaccination and the sharing of credible information around that. Of course, faith or belief communities should not be expected to either promote vaccination campaigns or to somehow back particular scientific evidence as true. But what they can do is to look for credible information that, when they have that, to spread it on, and disseminate it. Sorry, religious leaders could look to disseminate that with the congregations, explaining why perhaps certain measures then have to be taken on that basis. So I would say that's a last best practice. I will end there, and if possible, it'd be great to show the videos.
Well, this pandemic has affected all of us in one way or the other, and religious communities specifically got hit by the restrictions that were put in place. For many religious communities, these limited attendance at weddings, funerals or regular services, closed worship places, or even led to blanket bans on all religious gatherings. While state can legally limit people's free exercise of their religion or belief to protect protect health and lives, such restrictions should be prescribed by law. They have to be proportionate to the problem and applied in a non-discriminatory way. Importantly, restrictions should be constantly reassessed as they can quickly outlive their purpose. And later during the pandemic, religious leaders and communities had a significant role in providing spiritual help and support for people in distress and in this social distancing environment. Unfortunately, the pandemic reinforced prejudice and a number of negative stereotypes against religious groups who were unfairly blamed through conspiracy theories. Some state restrictions discriminated against specific religious groups and other minorities. Freedom of religion or belief is a litmus test for any democratic society, and the way that states protect this right reveals the level of protection of human rights generally. But most importantly, I think that states and communities should engage in active communication to make sure that all sides understand why restrictions are necessary, why they're put in place, and making also sure that people trust and understand the purpose of the restrictions. This is also important for avoiding frictions and tensions in society.